If you're wondering whether or not you're codependent, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm sharing 10 signs of codependency plus the goal of recovery in each one. But first, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So codependency is basically a pattern of behavior where you overly focus on other people to get love and approval. You don't have a solid sense of self, and there are a certain set of behaviors so that you can start to heal your self-esteem and your relationships, because that's where codependency hurts us the most. So the first sign of codependency is that you give until it hurts. Now, most people who are codependent are incredibly giving and generous, and that's a lovely trait. But when it becomes compulsive, it hurts you. You might start to feel overwhelmed and anxious, and even resentful in your relationships because you're doing too much. So the goal in recovery is to give with boundaries. Be able to say no when it's good for you. Because when we're always saying yes and we mean no, it's going to hurt us in the long run. The next sign of codependency is that you rely too much on external sources for validation and self-esteem, because people who are codependent don't know how to validate themselves. So they look outside of themselves for that love and approval. And the problem is that creates a really unhealthy dependency. So the goal in codependency recovery is to find ways to validate yourself, because ideally we want a really healthy balance of internal validation that we give ourselves and external validation from the ones we love in our environment. Now, I know for me in my codependency, I used to try to stay connected for my validation. I would make several phone calls a day to stay connected because that's how I felt worthy. When I was alone, I didn't feel worthy. I didn't feel comfortable. I felt like I was coming out of my skin, and I don't want that for you either. If you relate it all to being codependent, say ditto in the comments, because you're not alone. I am right there with you. So the next sign of codependency is that your relationships feel one-sided, where you're doing all the heavy lifting. You're doing most of the calling or the texting or the helping. You're putting a lot of energy into your relationships where the other person isn't doing a whole lot other than taking. That's a real sign that you're in a codependent relationship, when it's very one-sided. So the goal in codependency recovery here is to do less in your relationships and try to strike a healthy balance between giving and taking. Because while it's never going to be 50-50 exact, the goal is to at least feel like your relationships are mutually beneficial, not just beneficial to them. The next sign of codependency is when you feel other people's feelings more than your own. Codependent people are really good at being empathic. So they know when other people are in pain, because that's how they survived their childhood. Is when we grow up codependent, we know what other people are feeling because that's how we avoid danger. Codependents are really good at taking the emotional temperature of the room. And while that's a great trait, too much of that is not a good thing. So when we feel other people's emotions, ironically, we're not feeling our own. In fact, a lot of times codependent people will tell me that they know how their partner's feeling, but they have no idea how they're feeling. Because when we're codependent, our focus is on what other people need rather than what we need. So the goal in codependency recovery is to start feeling our own feelings, which means paying attention to what's happening in our body so that we can start to take better care of ourselves. The next sign of codependency is that you feel compelled to fix or rescue other people. When somebody else has problems, you're the first one to take action. You're right in there helping and doing whatever needs to be done. The problem is that you're wiping yourself out, and that other person doesn't get a chance to live their own life and take responsibility for their own problems because you want to fix it. And part of the reason why this happens when we're codependent is because we're really uncomfortable when the people we love are suffering. It actually makes codependent people anxious. I know for a long time I did this where I would immediately go to help somebody, and I didn't realize what I was really doing was avoiding my own feelings of anxiety because I couldn't tolerate seeing them suffer because it reminded me of my own suffering. So if that's something you relate to, say me too in the comments, because you're not alone. That is a very common trait in codependency. So the goal in codependency recovery is to be able to handle our own problems and let other people handle theirs. Because believe it or not, giving other people the dignity to handle their own life is sometimes the best form of love. Now, the next sign of codependency is that we tend to attract people who need fixing. You know, there's a saying in Al-Anon that says, Al-Anons don't have relationships, they have caseloads, because we tend to look for the person who needs us, who needs help, who is in dire straits, who has a lot of drama happening, because that's how the codependent person feels needed. Because when we're codependent, our worth comes from our relationships, not from ourselves. We actually unconsciously look for people that need us so we can feel important. Now, the thing is when we're fixing and rescuing other people, it makes us feel productive, but not in a healthy way. So the goal in codependency recovery is to find healthier ways to matter based on who you are, not what you do for others. The other goal really is to start attracting people based on similar likes and values instead of based on need. Because when we have relationships based on need, they tend to drain us and they tend to be codependent. The next sign of codependency is you get into toxic relationships and you can't leave. Because codependent people have a really hard time letting go. It's incredibly painful because there's usually a fear of abandonment underneath from childhood. So for a codependent to leave a relationship, it takes a lot. So I really want you to be gentle with yourself here, because this may be a longer term goal in your recovery, not something you're gonna do right away. In fact, the goal of codependency recovery here is to be able to build a relationship with yourself so that you can tolerate being alone and actually enjoying your company, so you can stand with or without a primary relationship, because that's a real sign of health. The next sign of codependency is when you can't tolerate making mistakes because it triggers intense shame. Most people who are codependent tend to have perfectionistic tendencies and very unrealistic expectations of themselves. You either are the best or you're the worst. There's no middle ground. And that's not healthy, because we're human and we're gonna make mistakes. That's just part of life. It shouldn't be a judgment against yourself. So in codependency recovery, the goal is to actually be imperfect and to let yourself have mistakes without beating yourself up. The next sign of codependency is that you accept unacceptable behavior and you don't even realize it. Because most codependent people grow up in a dysfunctional family where nobody talked about dysfunctional or abusive behavior. So we didn't get to understand that it wasn't okay. We just learned to live with it, and actually, in some cases, think that it's love when it's really abuse. So part of the goal in codependency recovery is to learn how to spot those unhealthy or narcissistic behaviors that are really going to hurt you in the long run, especially when you first meet somebody, because the goal in codependency recovery is to build healthier relationships. And the first step in that is to attract healthier people and to spot those unhealthy people earlier. The last sign of codependency is that you don't trust your own perceptions. And this is because most people who are codependent grow up with a lot of gaslighting. Parents or caregivers or family members that denied their feelings, denied their reality, and made them question themselves. So if this is you, you are not alone. Gaslighting is a very common childhood abuse behavior that we suffer, which actually contributes to us being codependent. Because when we don't trust ourselves, we look to other people for our answers. And so the goal in codependency recovery is to actually learn how to trust yourself. And if you need help with that, there's my self-trust journal you can look at in the description of this post. But really, the goal in recovery is to be able to rebuild a sense of yourself and have healthier connections without sacrificing yourself. So the next step, I want you to go watch my video on codependency recovery, because that's your next step. Thanks so much.